society in the interest of the millions, not the millionaires. That means putting the major companies and banks which dominate our economy into democratic public ownership.
Good evening. This is an extraordinary period for America's economy.
In 2007, a crisis erupted in the US housing market, which soon spread around the world.
Markets overnight with Asian stocks
Stocks fell off a cliff, the largest single point drop in history.
Share prices continued to tumble in the aftermath of the Lehman collapse.
The result was a global recession, which cost the world tens of trillions of dollars, rendered 30 million people unemployed, and doubled the national debt of the United States.
And welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate on the motion, Karl Marx was right. Capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions.
Take the blue pill, and you'll wake up in Cologne as the editor of a provincial newspaper. Take the red pill, and I will show you how far the permanent revolution goes.
Capitalism doesn't destroy wealth.
We are in deep shit, and we know it.
Markets have frozen, a serious financial crisis.
But secretly, we don't really believe that it can all fall apart and so on.
Financial assets related to home mortgages have lost value during the housing decline.
Today, Karl Marx and the idea of communism are back in vogue. The original revolutionary socialist has become a cultural icon. But can Marx's critique of capitalism really help us through our crisis-ridden times?
Marxism, as we understand it as sociologists, is a political and economic philosophy, a view of the way things are now, and suggestions as to where society is headed. The danger is that we start to view it based on what we understand about its relationship to communism and the politics and oppression of the old Soviet Union. Marx never saw communism in this way. He saw it as liberation and as a leveller, a way of creating a fairer society and of a way of getting the best out of all people, not just those with money and power. Marx was formulating his theories during the Industrial Revolution, a time when Britain and other countries were going through a very dramatic change. The old feudal system, when lords of the manor owned the land, meant that the ordinary people had freedom and rights to all land. It was held in common. When the government passed a number of enclosure acts in the 1700s and 1800s, ordinary people no longer had the right to live on this land, and many of them were forced to pack up and move to the towns and the cities, which were beginning to grow due to the increase in factories and textile mills.
According to Marx, capitalism thrives on the exploitation of the working class. For Marx, such exploitation was the main cause of social conflict, or class struggle, between capitalists determined to increase their profits and workers struggling to earn a living.
The Industrial Revolution promoted a capitalist way of thinking. Not only did Marx see them as being treated unfairly or being oppressed, he also saw the system as one that tried very hard to make sure that the poor stayed poor and the rich continued to get richer.
An under-regulated banking sector is often regarded as having been responsible for the economic crisis which began in 2007.
Today we have to revisit the Asian economic crisis.
Marx devoted his life to studying capitalism and its crises. For many thinkers, the question of exploitation remains as important today as it was in Marx's time. Which examples from history might help us avoid ever greater catastrophes in future?
1775, the American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy. King George III of England outlawed the interest-free, independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves, in turn forcing them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England at interest, immediately putting the colonies into debt. In 1783, America won its independence from England. However, its battle against the central bank concept had just begun.
The Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds were determined to set up a central banking system in America. J.P. Morgan, one of the most influential bankers of his day, caused massive panic in the markets by spreading rumors that many private banks were about to go bankrupt. This caused widespread panic. Everyone started withdrawing their deposits, and the banks had to call in all of their loans to try and survive. The hysteria destroyed the markets, and the banking elites, having caused the panic, used it to influence politicians and the public that a central bank would bring stability to the system.
So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? It doesn't exist. The bank is simply inventing it, putting up nothing of its own, except for a theoretical liability on paper. The amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the act of expanding the money supply, without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy, will always debase a currency. Prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
The last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835. President Andrew Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank, stating at one point, "The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people, should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." Unfortunately, his message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve.
Have we been living in a dream? Is the capitalist world about to be unmasked as an ideological illusion?
Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank.
Could it be that economic crisis, instead of being an unwanted side effect, is what keeps the system going?
Capital functions by breaking down. Crisis allows the possibility for new concentrations of capital.
For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of a small group of international bankers.
From 1921 to 1929, the banks drastically increased the money supply, making millions of loans. Then, in October 1929, having quietly exited the markets, they started calling in those loans. The hysteria that followed led to the Great Depression. The bankers bought up rival banks and massive corporations for pennies on the dollar. Congressman Louis McFadden, a long-time opponent of the banking cartels, began bringing impeachment proceedings. But sadly, after 2 failed assassination attempts, he was poisoned at a banquet.
But do Marxist theories of exploitation and class struggle still hold true today? Or is the way in which capitalists make their profits changing?
Wall Street and the president do see eye to eye. I've talked to many leaders of Wall Street. They all say we're behind the president 100%.
After the Great Depression, the United States had 40 years of economic growth. In 1982, the Reagan administration deregulated savings and loan companies, allowing them to make risky investments with their depositors' money. One of the most extreme cases was Charles Keating. Keating hired an economist named Alan Greenspan. Greenspan praised Keating's sound business plans and expertise. Keating went to prison shortly afterwards. As for Alan Greenspan, President Reagan appointed him chairman of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. This crisis cost taxpayers $124 billion and cost many people their life savings. During the Clinton administration, deregulation continued under Greenspan, and Treasury Secretaries Robert Rubin, the former CEO of the investment bank Goldman Sachs, and Larry Summers, a Harvard economics professor. The next crisis, that caused $5 trillion in investment losses, came at the end of the 90s. The investment banks had promoted internet companies they knew would fail. By the time George W. Bush took office in 2001, the U.S. financial sector was vastly more profitable, concentrated, and powerful than ever before. In the early 2000s, there was a huge increase in the riskiest loans, called subprime. Since anyone could get a mortgage, home purchases and housing prices skyrocketed.
曼兄弟已经进入了破产清算程序，著名的会计事务所普华。
Crise, panique. La presse française annonce clairement la couleur.
The bankruptcy of the U.S. investment bank Lehman Brothers and the collapse of the world's largest insurance company, AIG, triggered a global financial crisis. Unemployment in the United States and Europe quickly rises, and as U.S. consumers cut back on spending, Chinese manufacturers see sales plummet. Over 10 million migrant workers in China lose their jobs.
All the billions spent in fiscal rescue packages are flowing only to the unbalanced financial market.
Y estamos en una crisis que ha sido creada por los servicios financieros que juegan al casino con el dinero de todos.
Ich bin mal sicher, dass die Situation die gleiche ist wie in Spanien. Also ihr könnt verstehen, wovon ich spreche. In Portugal, alle und in Italien, alle südeuropäische Länder.
The euro launched on January 1st, 1999. Countries adopting the euro, called the euro area, discontinued their own currencies, giving control to the newly formed European Central Bank. The amount they could borrow skyrocketed. Things continued this way as long as credit was available, and credit was available until 2008. Suddenly, the economy couldn't function. If Greece defaults, then Spain could default. Italy, Portugal, and Ireland could be next. Then France, then Germany. Pretty soon, it could spread not just across Europe, but across the world.
Is capitalism destroying itself and the wealth of the planet with it?
You have a $14 million oceanfront home in Florida. You have a summer vacation home in Sun Valley, Idaho. You and your wife have an art collection filled with $1 million paintings.
JP Morgan took over first Bear Stearns and then WAMU. Bank of America took over Countrywide and Merrill Lynch. Wells Fargo took over Wachovia.
Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch were all in on this. They knew what was happening.
The system worked.
bottom level. I mean, you know, there really are only two classes, and you know, one of them exploits the other.
Capitalism's flaws are leading people to consider political alternatives. What power or incentive do governments have to reform capitalism?
The era of greed and irresponsibility on Wall Street and in Washington has led us to a financial crisis as serious as any that we faced since the Great Depression.
If you take over banks, if you take over car companies, if you...
I think Barack Obama is a socialist.
I graduated Columbia University class of '83 with Barack Obama, my classmate. We were both pre-law, political science majors. I called it before we ever had the 2008 election. I said pretty much every classmate I ever had at Columbia University was either a communist, a socialist, or a Marxist. And you see what you get with Barack Obama.
How many times have I said on this program, socialism, collectivism, communism, whatever you want to call it, eventually descends into the single path. There is only one way to think. There is only one way to feel. There is only one thing to be seen, only one book to be read. Where do you see in the world where the people have freedom the way we do in the United States?
When you go full left side, you've got socialism, communism, fascism. Fascism would be Hitler, the Nazis. Communism would be the USSR, and socialism, most any European country today, really. And the scary thing about that is the socialists aren't just in Europe. They're here, in America, in Congress, in the White House.
You know, I actually have respect for our next guest because he's one of the few in America that just doesn't mince words. He is a socialist. And I respect that much more than other people pretending that they're not. Frank Llewellyn, director of the Democratic Socialists of America. How are you, sir?
All right. Good to meet you, Glenn.
I feel you like me already.
Well, I like you as an individual.
Would you like an M&M?
No, thank you.
I'll share them, and you know why? Because I choose to share them. Not because somebody tells me to share them.
What you doing here?
I'm redistributing the wealth. I learned in school spreading the wealth is good for everyone.
Well, I learned from real life that it's not. In fact, there's a word for it. It's called theft.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? The scary monster of which I speak? Socialism.
But in America, there's still a little confusion about what socialism really means. Well, in your view, what is socialism?
I have no idea, actually.
If I go to college and I don't know what it means, then I don't really expect mainstream America to know more than I do.
Is socialism really this big bad wolf that America seems to think it is?
What are socialism and communism? By Marxist-Leninist theory. Marxists argue that communism can only be reached after a period of historical development which they call socialism. In this stage the state still exists as well as money and also material scarcity. However, in order to meet the needs of the people, a market economy is replaced by a planned economy, where instead of production being controlled by blind market forces only caring for profit, the people get together and decide what to produce. The working class has taken state power, the means of production are owned by the working class through the workers' state and various cooperative organizations. What then is communism? Communism means a higher stage of development. There is no state, no money, no private ownership of the means of production, and there exists a superabundance of resources.
So what about Obama?
I wish Obama was a socialist. I wish that he would distribute the wealth in a way that would benefit the majority of the people of this country. What's happening in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in other parts of the world, that's socialism, where the masses of the people now have control of the resources of that country.
Often, socialism is portrayed as a blood-sucking vampire. Who stands to benefit from making socialism out to be evil?
1% of people sitting at the top that control over 50% of the wealth. To them, socialism is a very scary and very dangerous thing. There's this great divide between people who struggle to make ends meet and then a small group of people that own the products of our labor, that squander it on wars, that squander it on bank bailouts. Stockpiles of medicine are destroyed because they can't be sold at a profit while they're sick people. Entire crops of food are burned to the ground because to keep the price of food high while they're starving people. We create the wealth. We should decide how it's spent.
For Marx, class struggle was part of everyday life. But is regulation of the economy the only solution?
Is there not a conflict when you sell something to somebody and then are determined to bet against that same security and you don't disclose that to the person you're selling it? You see a problem?
In the context of market making, that is not a conflict.
Since deregulation began, the world's biggest financial firms have been caught laundering money, defrauding customers, and cooking their books again and again and again.
North America correspondent Jane Cowan reports.
Executives of Europe's biggest bank accused of effectively being financiers to drug kingpins, rogue nations and terrorists.
Citigroup, Barclays, JP Morgan Chase and Royal Bank of Scotland pleaded guilty to conspiring to manipulate foreign exchange rates. UBS and Bank of America received immunity. Instead, UBS pleaded guilty to rigging the interest rate benchmark known as LIBOR. It paid the Federal Reserve more than $500 million in fines, but that was less than expected, so its shares rose.
On degrees of unacceptability. Isn't this kind of shocking?
If the state and the economy are so closely intertwined, and if capitalism needs crisis to function, what sense is there in believing another world is possible?
Have you seen the CEO of the Seattle-based company who raised the minimum wage at his credit card processing company to $70,000 per year? Dan Price dropped his own salary from $1 million kahunas to $70,000 as well. Here is the man of the hour.
What you see is inequality in this country is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And a lot of times people are proposing government solution, like in Seattle where I live, we have the $15 an hour minimum wage. And for me, that's a sign of failure that we didn't self-regulate and self-govern.
Thoughts on this guy? Personally, I think he's a socialist.
We are here! We are here! To begin something new! Something new! Something humane! Something humane! Something sustainable!
Thousands of people supporting the Occupy movement, including students, labor workers, Occupy activists, are all taking to the streets.
Actions inspired by New York's Occupy Wall Street continue to spring up across the United States. As of Friday morning, the website Occupy Together, a hub for nationwide events in solidarity with Occupy Wall Street, reported gatherings in 840 cities.
Preparing to go international. Protests are due to take place in Canada, the UK, and are even spreading to Asia.
That energy that's happening in New York City and across the United States has definitely spread here to Asia. And actually, the youth movement here has mobilized on Facebook and on Twitter, and they're planning an actual Occupy Taipei, Seoul, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Jakarta, Hyderabad, and even Islamabad.
We've had enough. That's the message being sent from many around the world to big business and government as people in almost 1,000 cities take their anger to the streets. The Occupy Together movement, which began in New York, is now demanding global change.
A coalition of labor groups, including the Transport Workers Union, the National Nurses United, SEIU 1199, the United Federation of Teachers.
The People's Assembly is a coalition between various MPs, between trade unions, between celebrities, campaigns.
Anti-austerity protesters went head-to-head with police in the heart of the British capital. They marched on Downing Street.
We're in Brighton on a march for free education. There are similar protests happening all over the UK today.
Mit einer europaweiten Politik von Dumpinglöhnen, Leiharbeit und Zerstörung der sozialen Infrastruktur zahlt die Mehrheit die Zeche für die Krise.
There is another choice, and Iceland decided to pursue it. Their debt-to-income ratio back in 2008 was an unbelievable 240%. So the size of their problem was even larger than the size of our problem when you look at it per capita and proportionally. So huge problem. Well, then obviously you need to make sure the banks are afloat, right? Otherwise, they can't take the action that they need to take. Here's what the people of Iceland decided instead. No, we're coming for you. And not only did they have protests, but they were starting to throw rocks at the Parliament building.
All kinds of people from all the different political parties, from all walks of life, people you had never seen protesting before.
It's now known as the Pots and Pans Revolution. No injuries, few arrests, but it was enough to force special elections. The Prime Minister replaced.
They decided, well, that's not enough, so let's go ahead and arrest the former chief executives of the 3 biggest banks. And over 200 criminal charges for the bankers. Now wait, we were told here in the United States, well, you can't do that! You'll destroy the economy. So what they did was they forgave debt exceeding 110% of home values. So if you were underwater and it was above 110%, they just forgave that portion of the debt. Now here in the US, that makes people in power's head explode. How could you, these irresponsible people? Who, the bankers who crashed the economy? No, I love those guys. No, the homeowners who got tricked by the bankers into taking these loans with exploding interest rates. In fact, it is now doing much better than the European Union, and it's even doing better than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Those are all the developed countries. So they're beating the rest of the world.
So the news is, no has won the Greek referendum. Let me just put that into context. Here's who was backing yes. Angela Merkel, the European Commission, the whole political establishment, every private TV station, every political party here, except the far left party, Syriza, and its right-wing ally, ANEL. And they have to probably understand that for the first time in the history of the Eurozone, people power has happened.
What happens next?
Basically what the Greek people had a choice between 2 bad things. One being going on with the humanitarian disaster as it was without any perspective for improvement, and the other was, okay, in the short term it's going to be still bad, but at least we might have a chance to take our fate into our own hands. So they chose for the second one, and I believe that this is going to be followed by many other people in other European countries who say, hey, if the Greek can be so courageous, well, why can't we?